So we're about 2 minutes after 10. We'll try and stay on time. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this June Friday morning. As you can see, it is casual Friday around here for me, and everybody gets the benefit of t-shirt and no makeup, Katie. Sorry for not making myself more presentable for you, but this is just what you get on a June Friday morning, and you may or may not see my children run in. I am at my office, but they are too. So they may or may not pop in and ask me some sort of question that they are not supposed to ask me because they know I'm in a meeting. So I'll just excuse myself and them if that happens. So as always, thank you for your time. LaTana, do you want to check the box for us of running over the meeting or the rules for the meeting?
Yes. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Again, yes, this is LaTana Lawrence. I'm the program coordinator for the Georgia Child Support Commission, and I will briefly discuss a few rules to help us navigate the meeting today via our Zoom webinar. The Statute Review Subcommittee meeting members and staff are designed as panelists within Zoom and can speak anytime during this meeting. All other participants are designated as attendees and are muted during the meeting, but may type a message in the Zoom chat feature if needed. The Child Support Commission does not hear public comment during any of its subcommittee meetings. Accordingly, we will not be accepting public comments today. However, you may leave a written comment for the commission at any time through the commission's website. I'll put that in the chat. And for your convenience, excuse me, I'm getting crossed with my words. But anyway, also anyone wishing to give public comment by speaking may do so at any full Child Support Commission meeting, the next one, which will be held on August the 11th, 2023.
At 10 a.m.
Oh, 10 a.m. Thank you. And also, in conclusion of today's meeting, the staff will post the recording on our YouTube channel, our new YouTube channel that we have, which is called the Georgia Child Support Commission. I will place the YouTube channel in the chat for everyone, so you can either click the link or just search the YouTube name. And I will turn it back over to Katie.
Thank you, LaTana. Are we at quorum? Should we address minutes or should we pause that for?
Yes, I am thrilled to say we have quorum. 8 of 14 members are here.
Terrific. Isn't that exciting and bodes well for what kind of meeting we're going to have? So hopefully everyone has had a chance to go over the May 19th, 2023 meeting minutes. The draft has been circulated for members to review. Does anyone have any suggested edits or amendments to those minutes?
I don't, but I want to just mention Christina Scott just joined, so now we're at 9 of our 14 member.
All right, yay. Okay, so Christina, I just asked if anybody had any suggested revisions or amendments to the May 19th, 2023 meeting minutes. Having heard none, I will ask for a vote. So let's vote to let's ask if we vote to approve. So if you are voting in the affirmative, that would be to approve the minutes. And please indicate by raising your virtual hand or your actual hand so that it can be seen on the screen.
Okay, we have 8 of the 9. Jason Nonis hasn't responded, so
okay,
it passes.
All right, it passed. Jason just gave us the high sign.
The high sign, good.
It looks like he's driving, so he's trying to be safe, which we appreciate. Jason, please be safe. All right, so thanks for that. All right, so we will move on to the business of the subcommittee, where we get to let's see, we're headed towards low income deviation. I believe is first on our agenda. So unless Judge Williford has anything she wants to add at this point, we can turn it over to Judge Palmer.
No, I'll just say that maybe this is a good time for me to just jump in before we start the business of the low income deviation and the parenting time issues, that Katie and I presented at the Family Law Institute a couple of weeks ago in Amelia on the work of the commission, and particularly a lot of it had to do with the work that this subcommittee is working on. And I want to thank the staff and Noel especially for putting together such a wonderful presentation. We got a lot of feedback from folks who enjoyed the presentation, found it to be very informational and, dare I say, shocking. I had plenty of folks who came up to me who said, I've been malpracticing people for 15 years. I had no idea. I thought it was this way. So there were a lot of we did facts versus folklore. So there were a lot of things that people thought was the law under child support and parenting time and low income deviation, that in fact is not the law. And so we have a lot of work to do. Both of these topics got a lot of responses that people were not familiar with what the law is. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of educating, and you know, the process for how to do things. And so I just want everybody to know that, and I know you all know how important this work is, because these were, like I said, this was, I don't know how many people attended that, but several hundred, probably closer to 1,000 family law practitioners in this room. And like I said, when we asked them to raise their hand, whether this was a fact or whether it was a folklore, if it was a folklore, we had a lot of hands raised that said it was a fact, and vice versa. So this is very important work that we're doing on this subcommittee. And I appreciate y'all all so much. All right. And Judge Palmer, I think you get the first hour on your low income deviation work. So why don't we turn it over to you?
All right. I Dr. Vanur prepared a memo about the issues, we talked about at the last meeting. She revised it a couple of times. The latest revision, I think everyone got a copy of that. Isn't that right, Elaine?
Yes, sir.
And I don't, I've spent some time reviewing it before today, and I'm happy with it. I mean, there's some issues, we need to discuss, but I tried as hard as I can to come up with criticisms or whatever, and I can't. This is really sort of exactly what I was looking for. But Dr. Vanur, would you broke your memo down into a couple of sub issues. There were a couple of sort of choices we needed to make. And are you able to just go through those with us? I mean, is that a good way to do it, you think? And the first one being whether or not and this was what you included in here was a Utah style low income table that you sort of prepared for Georgia. And it had the sort of the first issue that you pointed out was you had the minimum order kicking in at $800 a month. That sounds about right to me. You pointed out that was below the federal poverty guideline, but I think it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference if you started applying a percentage at that number. I think that, that sounded about right to me. I can't think of a good reason to change that. Do you have any other comments you want to make on that issue?
I'm not sure if everybody read the memo or had an opportunity, so I don't want to repeat. I just want to make sure everybody understands the Utah adjustment. And so I'm asking if I should backtrack and do that example that's shown in the middle of the first page and then.
Well,
plunge
yeah,
into-
maybe that's a good idea. Do that. And that, I mean, we don't have to spend, 30 minutes on it, but
Yeah.
you can
And-
do that.
And, and actually, Judge Palmer gave me a lot of hints on the vision of this. So I'm glad that I listened to him, and that's probably why I couldn't find any criticism.
You did a good job. Yeah.
So anyway, what happens is if you look at page 2 of the memo, is that there's the regular table, which is excerpted at the top. And then there's the low income table. And so what the statute would need to do is to direct the guidelines user, the judge, to look at if the payer's parent falls in the area of the second table. So if their income is less than 1,500, you have to do 2 calculations. You would do the regular calculation, and on page 1 is an example where we have 3 children, a payer parent's income is 1,250, and this is why I changed the memo like 3 times. And the receiving parent's income is 750, so that's 2,000 total. So if we were to look at the exurbates table, which is the top one on page 2, we see that the basic obligation is 723. The obligor's prorated share is 62.5%. That's 452. And then we check it against the low income table. We look at the 1250 and we see it's 408. Or I'm sorry, 435. And then we take the lower of 452 and 435. And so that would be 435 in that example. Any questions?
The question I have, and this is not really for Dr. Vanur, and it's not really directed to the substance of this, but Elaine, I've sort of been traveling under the assumption that incorporating this, into the software, if you will, of the calculator is not a problem. I mean, somebody can do that.
Yes, sir. That's
Isn't
correct.
that
We
right?
can,
Where if you put in a number that would trigger the low income table, that's going to happen. It's going to put you there automatically. I mean, nobody's going to have to do this outside of the calculator. Is that correct? I mean,
That's
that
correct.
might seem obvious, but I just want to make sure that I'm right about that.
yeah, we'll automate that process completely.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have other questions about that? I like it. I mean, this is what exactly the kind of thing I was looking for.
I have a question. Jane,
Yes, ma'am.
on page 2, we have it listed at the top of the chart, paying parents gross income.
Mm.
Is that, I'm just confused by that, I guess. Are we
I
saying
apologize. You could, that was a typo. That should have been combined income.
it should be combined? Okay. I was like,
Oh
what?
yeah, I didn't even notice that. I don't think that isn't just the paying parents income, right?
Right. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, so that would be the combined. And just talking through this scenario, we have the, can we just use our terminology? I mean, we call it non-custodial parent being the payer. That's, that's what we currently have. So
Yeah.
in your scenario, you have the non-custodial parent earning how much? Was it 1,000 from the?
1,250. So close to full-time minimum wage.
Got it. And the custodial, the receiver parent?
750.
Okay, I'm sorry, and I apologize. I must have somehow not brought the latest one with me. I'm traveling at the moment, so I'm looking at something that has
Yeah,
different.
she revised it a couple of times, and the one I'm working from is dated June the 20th. Is that right? Isn't that the latest one?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
if
and
you
that,
have
and
the,
that, and that initial example has the non-custodial parent making $1,250 a month and the other parent at $750. And that's how we came up with the 435 reduced from 452 as
Okay,
the amount.
so if the, we're going, the top of that chart should say like the parents' combined adjusted income, yeah, combined income, that's currently 2,000, that 1,250 and the 750. So, and for 3 children we're doing,
Yes.
right,
so we go over and we've got the BCSO at 723. And then, and you're saying based on the pro rata shares, what would the obligor's percentage be? Then you'd run a second one where it's the paying parent only. Is that what's
and the
going?
non-custodial parents' income only.
Okay, so at the top, if at $2,000, what, because this is just a table, I'm not seeing pro rata shares. So what is the NCP's obligation using just the top table?
452.
452. Okay.
Right.
And then you're saying that the process would be to go down to the second table. This time using only the NCP's gross income, which we have is 1,250.
Right.
And slide over to 3 kids, that obligation is 435. So as between 452 and 435, we're going to go with the 435. That's
Right.
the
You get a discount when you
Yeah.
go to the low income table. Basic is, one way to say it.
okay.
And Noella, when you finish, I want to follow your questions.
Sure. Okay, I mean, it's a big change. You know what I mean? Like previously, if there was an extreme economic hardship found, we would have dropped it down to 200, like 100 for the first child and 50 for each additional child. So this is going to be 435 as opposed to what if a low income deviation was granted in full. Arguably, it's not granted in full every time, but it could have been just 200. So I'm just wrapping my head around that.
Or would it be 250 if there were 3 children?
I think it's 100 for the first kid and then so 150 for the second and a total of 200.
Okay, I got you. You're right. Sorry, my math.
Would you apply it to NCP earning 1,250?
Well, that's a
Oh,
really
well,
interesting question, Jane. I mean, the law allows it. It's my understanding that years ago, there was a hard and fast rule, a black line rule of 1850 or less got a low income deviation. This is years ago. This is maybe 10 years ago. And the commission changed the wording of the statute to make it more flexible and more utilized, but that actually has not been the case. I don't think that's played out in the case sampling data. It's
No,
lower than ever. So it didn't make it.
4%.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
exactly. I was like, so that's problematic. I just think it's problematic. It was meant to be more flexible and encourage greater usage, and I think it's actually so it's not being used. So
Yeah, just for the record, the low income guidelines deviation is being used in 4% of the cases. And what we see in other states is closer to 10 to 20%.
right.
And yeah.
Well, this is going to happen automatic. I mean, a judge can still adjust the amount to be whatever they want, if there's some extreme situation. But I mean, if this happens the way I envision it, every single time somebody fills out a child support worksheet on the calculator, this is going to be applied if it's appropriate. Which is, I think what we want to do. Are you saying, Noel, that the amount should be lower I mean, is that,
I mean, I am surprised at how relatively high they are. Isn't like 435 out of,
you just say
somebody's
that's not
gross
much of a difference
well, it's not much of a difference. We're going through a lot of extra steps for, I don't know what it,
to not do
less
much.
than 20 bucks.
Yeah.
And that still has got to be, just off the top of my head, about 30% of the income. Jane, I thought your literature said that there's concerns about folks not paying when it exceeds 20%. So, right, if somebody,
If I may, we can change this table any way that the subcommittee believes this is important. And the two things that I anchored, and these are the two decisions that affect the amounts, is that first line that starts off with below 800. I chose that because that's the where your schedule starts now.
Right.
And if you wanted to make a policy decision, which is consistent with other states, you could start that at the poverty level, which would be 1,215. You could start that at where supplemental security income benefits are, which is SSI. Some states, one state actually, North Dakota, uses that as their low income, and that's about 900. Another thing that states anchored on is their minimum wage. Another thing that they use is the SNAP benefit level, which is 130% of the poverty. So that's about 1,500. So where you start it is important. And those starting points, I used 20% of income because of in the federal rule making in the narrative, they cited research that says if the order is more than 20% of the income, arrears accumulate. That study is actually 20% for one child and then up to 28% for more children. So that's the reason I use those percentages. And the second reason I use percentages is because, as you may recall, Louisiana had an issue with their minimum order of $100. That the feds wrote a letter and said that that's not appropriate, that, you know, you're supposed to base it on ability to pay. And if there's no income, if you take a percentage, you're going to get no order. And I do see that Christina's hand is up, and I'll just finish this thought and stop. And so that's why I selected that. And then I selected 1,500. That's arbitrary too. That could be a policy decision. It could be based on anything that you wanted. You know, for instance, I said that SNAP benefits are 130% of the poverty. So is that threshold of poverty? Some people say use 200%. Some people, some states use 185% for Medicaid. And then if you look at the amounts in between, I just perfectly interpolated it. So if you look, it's all as an even dollar increase. So, you know, so there's some discretion there. I'll stop there and return it.
Noel, the other, remember now too, that number, we're talking about 3 children.
right,
You know, so it might be more instructive to just look at what it would be for one child, just to,
mhm. Yeah, because I do think
because it's
most
obviously
orders-
going to go up. You know, if there's 4 or 5 children or something, it's going to be more,
Right.
whatever you use. But if you know, the 1,250 for one, the number would be 276. That sounds about right. You know?
And I want to jump in here and follow up on what Noel was saying, because I think it's important to note that the 452 is the BCSO. So my question, Jane, would be, we're still going to adjust the gross income on Schedule B that would give us a new income amount on line 2 of the worksheet. And then the amount on the table could be less, correct? Because we're still adjusting before we get to the selection of the BCSO.
Right. So there's yeah, this should be
Right.
adjusted income
Okay.
for the 2 tables.
So the BCSO amount could come down from what we're looking at possibly if that non-custodial parent has qualified children, either parent for that matter, or owes on a pre-existing child support order. So I wanted to point that out. So by the time we get to line 4, we have a different BCSO amount that is still going to be broken down between the parents, but we're also, I guess I want to understand, once you go to the second table and you're selecting the different BCSO for the 3 children, like in this instance, you were using the 435, I think, yeah. Could there still be Schedule D adjustments that are additional expenses that are impacting that, either up or down?
We have to talk about that. That's a policy,
Okay.
that's a
That's another
secondary
issue.
policy
Okay.
decision.
And then my other question is the 1,500. We're not bound by that, like you said. This group can decide we want to do something higher than the 1,500, even as much as 2,000. But that's something that this group can talk about and decide. Okay, I just wanted to point those things out. So, and I know Christina and Deborah both have their hands up. So who's going to go first?
I guess I have more so of a, it's kind of a question, but also a concern. I kind of feel like Noelle as well. I guess I'm concerned with, and I realize this is for 3 children. So, you know, I think most of the cases in the research, you had like 2 children on average, but just kind of concerned when I look at a gross parent's income of the $1,250 and then to pay $435 seems like a huge amount of their income, their ability to live and support and to be able to be a good parent if they're stressed about how they're going to live every month. So I guess I would be in favor of looking at something where, and I'm not sure how this works, Dr. Venor, if we use a higher amount, if it adjusts the numbers either higher or lower, whatever is going to kind of, I think, give more of a, in my mind, a realistic number for 3 children.
I will make it clear on how you would accomplish that. One is that you, instead of using 800 for the bottom, you would use a higher income. And I
Okay.
would suggest that you pick something that makes sense for you in Georgia. And then the second way you could do it, actually, you would have to probably do it from the 800. If you started that at a higher amount, it's going to lower it. That would
Okay.
probably be the biggest thing. And then where you stop it, like at 2,000 instead of 1,500, is not going to have, it's also going to impact it, but it's not going to have as big of an impact as the lower number, the 800.
Okay. So it can be adjusted, is what you're saying. We could choose the federal poverty number or the SNAP guidelines that you were mentioning to adjust it.
And keep in mind, the big issue here is that you impute, and this could have been because of COVID, you know, there was a lot of income imputation after COVID. You know, a lot of people lost their jobs, so it's not surprising that a lot of judges imputed at minimum wage, full-time minimum wage, and that would be $1,257.
Right.
So, and the poverty level is at $1,215. So if you took that rule about the 20%, that would give you $250 right at about minimum wage, and then 28% of $1,250. Let me see. I want to get my calculator. I want to give it right because I've got so many windows out. I don't want to estimate it. Would be $350.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's a very important income to be thinking about, you know.
So hang on. So 28% of 1,250 would be how much?
350.
See, that's a lot lower than what the low income table. Well, that's what we need to do. Is just move that number up from 800 to. I didn't really catch that. That's because the difference, if you don't do that, I think Noelle is right. It's not going to be that much of a difference. It'll be some, but
If we And I can do that for the next meeting. I can lower it to, do you want to do 100% of the poverty level, or do you
What is
112,
that?
15?
What is that number?
112, 15, 1,215. I can actually do it both ways. The minimum full-time minimum wage and 1,215. The full-time minimum wage is actually 1,257, 1,257. And then the poverty level in 2023 is 1,215. And I will say that based on the analysis of labor market data, that, you know, like some of the lowest paying jobs in Georgia, you know, like dishwashing and stuff, are $10 to $11 an hour based on your labor market data.
Well, look, so if 20% of 1,500 is 300, right? So what we have on here is 340. Why don't you just do the percentages for starting at 1,500?
Which you said is the federal SNAP benefit level, right? 130% of the federal poverty level.
Yeah, I don't remember what that number was.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Judge Williford, to use that. You could have those percentages up to 1,500, which is, if it's good enough for the USDA for SNAP benefits, to say that somebody's poor at 130%.
That way, then the 1,500 for one child would be $300 and so on. Let's just do that, and that would move it significantly in Noel's direction.
And I don't
Noel,
wanna
you get to be the face of it.
Oh, God, I know, right? And I don't want to monopolize this conversation because I feel like I could always talk to Dr. Warner anytime. I really want the folks on.
Well,
this
I'm glad you did that. All right, that's what we're gonna do then.
Yeah, just what jumped out at me was, I think, relatively high percent of the paying parents' income. I'm calculating if it was 276 for one child, that's still 22%.
Yeah.
Of their gross income. And if it was that 435 for 3 kids, that's 35%. And that's what we're saying is the low income.
Yeah. You're right. That's not right. So do it. I want to start the percentages at 1,500. That's what we need to do. And then that'll make the change more meaningful. And it makes me feel better that that's the SNAP threshold or whatever. I didn't know that. But.
Carol, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I noticed that Deborah Johnson has her hand up in her little corner, and I'd really like to hear what Deborah, who's been working with this forever, has to say on this issue. So I didn't know if anybody saw the little yellow hand except for me.
Yeah,
So
Deborah, you got to be real assertive. Like, okay, go ahead, Deborah.
Well, thank you. I'm not on the statute review committee, but I am on the low income deviation study group, or whatever our title is. And yes, I was on a study group in 2009 that also looked at low income deviation. Seems like thought about it a lot. I wanted to ask a mechanical question and make one policy comment. The mechanical question is, and I think from what I've been hearing in the questions and answers, I've begun to understand how it would work. Am I understanding correctly that if the paying parents' income fits within whatever numbers are established on the Exhibit 16 table, if their income is on those numbers, then the low income deviation applies? Period. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That helps me understand. And I think that what Judge Palmer and maybe Judge Williford was also saying, this makes sense to me, to just, rather than have the percentages only apply at the very lowest end of that table, to have the percentages carry through that whole Exhibit 16 table makes sense to me. And for those who don't know me, I am now a retired lady of semi-leisure. But I worked for a million years representing low-income parents of both the custodial and non-custodial persuasion on child support and other issues. So that's my background and my perspective. And the sort of policy thing or what values thing I wanted to throw out there is that we're focusing in this discussion 100% on the impact on the non-custodial parent and their ability to survive on whatever money they've got. And I just wanted to mention that in the hypothetical that we've been talking about, if the non-custodial parent who has 2/3 of the total income ends up paying $400 and something a month in child support to the other parent who has $750 a month in income, that the custodial parent with the $750 plus the $400 and something just barely gets close to the total income that the non-custodial parent had before paying the child support. And that's the one that has the kids in the home. So I think it's important that just in our minds that we be mindful that, yes, we want to be kind to the non-custodial parent. I get that. But we also need to be kind to the children that are in the other home and are going to be impacted by the choices that are made here. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't have a low-income deviation. I think that it's good to have one. But I think we need to be mindful of how it impacts the whole family in both households.
If I
So
may,
I-
this,
I completely agree with that. And I try not to lose focus on that. But I think 20% is
Mhm.
makes sense. I think is everybody okay with just moving that percentage up to the $1,500 level for the low income table? Anybody think that's a bad idea? And that, I'm glad Noel said that. I really didn't. All right, then that's what we're gonna do. All right, we need to,
Well, Judge Palmer, if I might,
sure.
Dr. Vanor, do you have, and you may not be prepared to answer this, but is that what, I know you said some of the states do that. Is that the one you see used a lot? Is that rarely used? Do you have an idea that when we talk about the 1,500, the SNAP, the 130% of the federal poverty level, is there a reason why maybe we should go up or down from that? Or is that what the majority of states use? Or can you address that before we just randomly select one? Because I know you talked about some other levels too, but is there a reason why that one is better than others in your opinion, or do you have an opinion on that?
well, states do a range, like Kentucky is, I think theirs is close to 84% of the poverty, or in Alabama's because they're low income states. And then the highest is 150% of the poverty. Well, actually, Arizona's is their state minimum wage. So I think 130% is good. Where states are, there's such a wide range, but the states that are being progressive, I mean, the fact that Judge Palmer and a couple of other people latched on to that SNAP benefits, I would say that's a lot of states go, oh yeah, that makes sense, because non-custodial parents, single adults can get SNAP too. And I do want to say something real quick to Deborah's comment, if I may, is that if you look at page 10, the way what, this is a rebuttable presumptive, the low income, or what I'm hearing is that the calculator would automatically use that table. And then to make it fit, we were playing with where it would fit in statute. And what would fit with Deborah's and also fit with putting this in and meeting the federal requirement is to change that deviation requirement right now to an economic hardship and to make it for either parent. So it applies to either the mom or the dad. And that way you wouldn't have to apply the low income adjustment when in that case it was unfair, like the 750 income. So that's a way to contend with it. It doesn't mean that you have to do it that way, but there's a natural way to put it since you already have that language in there. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I'll stop there.
Are you,
this is-
Judge Williford, are you good with the 1,500?
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, okay.
It sounds good. Elaine, what were you saying?
Well, what I was going to say, and Jane's been working with Dr. Tutterow from the Economic Subcommittee on what our new table might look like, taking what we have now and what that might look like. So we do need to keep in mind that we may be looking at a new underlying table, BCSO, for Georgia, and that this low income would be factored in, this additional table would be factored in as well. So if any of the members want to speak to Dr. Tutterow about that, you could email him or call him and discuss that. But he and Jane are in communication right now about what the new table might look like, if it's going to be lower than what we have today. So keep that in mind. You may want to talk to Dr. Tutterow about that. And Jane, and I don't know if there's anything that you can address on that right now. I don't have any idea if it's too early in your conversations with him, because we have not selected a table from the Economic Subcommittee perspective.
Yeah, he and I talked Wednesday, and they're still working on it, and they're meeting mid-July, I think.
Right.
And I think what it would affect is how far we take it up on income, but it shouldn't affect that bottom one. The fact that you are saying 1,500 right now, that's probably the most important thing for me. And then it might affect the numbers a little bit once that subcommittee, or I'm not sure what their official name, makes that decision, but it should be in the general income area.
I can't imagine that would change it too much. I mean, maybe some, but the percentage would, it wouldn't change the percentage calculation. Well, look, we got 15 more minutes, and so there are a couple of other issues here I wanted to.
And Judge Palmer, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jane Jane also has to leave us a little bit early today. At about 20 till 12. Am I right, Jane? Okay, so we'll still need to talk on parenting time. So at any point that we finish our conversation on low income, we can go into parenting time. And we can, of course, continue to talk regardless of whether she's with us. But I wanted to point that out.
On page 3, Dr. Vanur raised the issue of integrating how we integrate the table into the guidelines. I touched on that before. I think it needs to be integrated into the process of calculating the number automatically as much as possible, which I understand her, as she put it on page 3, issue 1 would be her option B. And so we're kind of doing away with the step of somebody making it a deviation. If the income qualifies, then it would automatically kick in when you type it into the calculator, is the way I want to do it. But I just want to be sure I'm reading that right. And want to know if anybody disagrees with that. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
And Judge Palmer, that was my understanding as well, as
Yeah.
it would become an adjustment.
Right,
And when I spoke with Jane recently, I asked her to, help us discover where exactly that would sit in the worksheet calculation,
mhm,
what schedule, if it's necessary, or where it sits on the worksheet itself, so that we can understand that process of how that calculation comes in to the worksheet.
okay. The other thing was how you, what you would do with sort of add-on adjustments, like childcare expenses was the one she put in there. I guess there could be others for maybe health insurance or something like that. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I tried to think about it, and this is on page 3. She listed it as a sub option. One would be to apply the low income table after add-ons like childcare expenses, or before add-ons. What does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I'm not sure. I don't know what I think about
Dr. Venor, what is the norm on that, or is there a norm?
Well, if you apply the low income adjustment after, which is the last step, that ensures that low income is really based on the ability to pay. And I would say that's more the norm now, particularly given the narrative of the new federal reg. There's a few states that have held out and they do the add-ons at the end. So they do the low income adjustment first, and then they do the add-ons, and they say, well, if the childcare happens, then, the payer parent has to pay his or her fair share of that. And so it bumps up the order amount, but I would say most states are going away from that. I will point out that there's probably a lot of discussion in states about this, because Elaine will know this, and Noel, when they do the training, is that, everybody comes up with the weird scenario. And what we see in the data, and we saw this in Georgia, is that those low income parents don't usually have add-ons. If they are low income, they qualify for Medicaid. The childcare, they can get CAP, CCAP or TANF might have childcare benefits. So I would probably lean, because of federal reg and the push and the integrity, I would say keep the low income at the end, which would be
that. So
after.
you would do the add-ons first, and then.
Right.
I think that makes sense for the reason you just mentioned, that most of the time in these low income cases, there's not going to be a lot of stuff like that. There's not going to be a big payment for health insurance or whatever it is. I didn't think about that. All right.
All
And
right,
you can
so
still
Jane,
deviate.
okay, so you're saying we would get through Schedule B, we essentially would leave it like it is, adjusting the gross income.
Right.
And then we'll end up with whatever we end up with parenting time on Schedule C. That would become an adjustment. Then we go to Schedule D with our additional expenses. And at that point, we would adjust for low income after the inclusion of the additional expenses, right?
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have it in option B. That's just for the record. The option B that I have on page 8. I didn't prepare one that is the way that Judge Palmer described it, which is the low income adjustment at the very end. The one
Okay,
on
before we go to deviations. Okay.
yeah, so we would have to do this slightly different, but it's doable.
Yeah,
So
but
the one
you could do that. I mean, that wouldn't be that hard.
Right.
So that would become part of Schedule D. We would have to, after we've added the additional expenses, then we would have another component of Schedule D without having to rename Schedule E, maybe D1 or DA, I don't know, D1. And it then brings over the adjustment for the low income. And then we're looking at deviations on Schedule E. and a child support amount on line 13 or whatever number that becomes because of all the various calculations that we're, shifting around. We could have a line 17 that has our child support amount on it. Is this-
Elaine, I'd love to say that I followed all those, those schedules A, B, and C, but we
Right,
can have that
right.
conversation later. Yeah,
Okay.
but mechanics, yeah, we could
Yeah, I
talk
mean,
about the mechanics.
I want to make sure that the members are thinking about this, that we're going to be, and then there's no problem expanding the worksheet, and so forth. But I am thinking about what the schedules would be doing. So we have additional expenses on Schedule D. All of this becomes part of subsection B on the process of calculating child support. And so we do have to think about where, if we're going to put, a D1 in there, and it becomes then the low income adjustment. So it's adjusting then off of your calculation from Schedule D. And so most of you, I know Pat's very well aware of how that works, having trained it for many years. I mean, I'm just, and I know most of you do. Deborah helped write the original documents, for creating all of the schedules and so forth. So she knows how that works. Most of you do. So just think about that as well. We're now adding an additional adjustment. And that was my question to Jane when I talked with her Thursday week ago or so, was when y'all are talking about so much of what we're doing with low income and parenting time, my mind goes directly to how do I do this in the calculator? Because whatever the statute says, then we have to design it for the calculator. And so I'm always thinking about the mechanics of that process. So that's what, Jane, that's what I hear you saying, is we get to our additional expenses, and then we have to just name it low income adjustment, make it D1 or something, so it stays part of Schedule D. And
I'm not sure you have to do it on Schedule D, but we
Okay,
can
so
have that
maybe-
conversation later.
Okay, and I just, as you said that, and as we could just leave it on Schedule E, but call it an adjustment instead of a deviation. But we'll talk about that later. But these are things we have to think about.
And Deborah Johnson has had her hand raised again.
Okay.
You go, Deborah. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted. There you go.
Luckily, there's a message that flashes up when you start talking and you're still muted that tells you that. So I had the visual cue as well as your help, Lynn. If what we're really doing is making the low income deviation into a low income adjustment, then I think we should say that's what we're doing. And I think I'm probably pretty comfortable with that. Surprisingly, it's surprising to many of you, I'm sure. I'm trying to understand the mechanics of how the childcare and health insurance, if there is a health insurance issue, get factored in. And I wanted to mention that while Dr. Vanor is probably correct in saying in the world of DCSS cases, most of the custodial parents would qualify for caps, they don't get it. And that's important to know because there's a waiting list. There's a huge, long waiting list. So on paper, they qualify, but in real life, they're not getting it. And even if they do get it, it only reduces, for most of them, only reduces how much they pay for childcare. It doesn't eliminate it. But for those who were most of the clients I represented, they did not get caps. And so the cost of daycare is really important to people. And so my understanding of how the before and after thing works is kind of muddled. Are we saying if we that if we do the low income calculation, I'll say, rather than adjustment or deviation, if we do the low income calculation after we've added on the adjustment for childcare and, if applicable, health insurance, and I will agree that health insurance is not that often applicable in low income situations because children do get Medicaid. And even if there is health insurance available, people often would rather keep the Medicaid and not run the risk of being without insurance for the kids. But daycare is a big issue. So if those expenses are added before the low-income calculation happens, does that mean that they don't have any impact? And that the low, because we're looking at a percentage, and so if it's a percentage of income that determines how much the paying parent will pay if they have low income, then it's irrelevant whether the daycare cost is $100 a month or $1,000 a month. It's going to have no impact at all. Am I understanding that right, or have I totally messed that up?
Oh, if I may respond, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a waiting list for CCAP in most states. And if you look at page 3, the last full paragraph, what we found from the case file data is that only 1% of the DCSS cases had low income, $1,500 or less is what I used for that, and childcare. So it could be that there's a couple of factors that might explain that. One is that when parents separate, if they were married, it's usually when the kids are more teens. So they might be above age 12, which is the threshold that most use for the childcare. And then for never married, there's usually a lag between when the baby is born and when the child support is filed. And my data is a little old. I've been looking for more recent data, but usually it's at least 4 years. So what that means is, I don't know if Georgia has a preschool program that's subsidized. If they're 4, 5, or 6, I don't know your ages there. In Colorado, we do have a subsidized preschool that's statewide, so they would be in that. And then finally, that not only is there CCAP childcare, but TANF, gosh, I forgot the word for it, but to meet their maintenance of effort, most states use, and I don't know Georgia's statistics on this. I mean, Deborah, you might know it, but they usually use the child care. So it might be that there's 2 forces there, is that those children might be a little bit older and there might be after school care, which is definitely cheaper. And then there might be, some stuff happening from TANF. With regard to what Deborah said about the percentages, I'm not sure if the subgroup work has agreed to use percentages throughout that whole table, or just the way I formatted it in the memo, but we can talk about that later. I'll prepare it both ways. And but if it was a percentage, Deborah, the way that you were describing it, yeah, that would be a percentage.
And so in that instance, the daycare cost and the health insurance cost has no real impact because
Right.
the percentage it doesn't look at BCSO, it looks at the paying parents' income only. Is that correct?
Right, that's the way that it's still on the table is what I understand, but Judge Palmer, if I understood, was suggesting that made sense.
Yeah, and I'm just wanting to understand. There's no implicit criticism buried in that question. I'm just wanting to understand.
Well,
And
that was,
yeah.
I felt the same way, after reading this memo the other day, but I think I got it now.
Well, Judge Palmer and Jane, for the whole subcommittee, obviously we're at a point where we need to transition into parenting time.
Okay.
And Jane only has about 39 minutes left with us. So Jane, are you comfortable with what changes you're going to make based on the discussions?
I think what I see my marching orders is to provide a couple more tables and that you can look at that starting at 1,500.
That's right. That's the main thing is slide that that, percentage type calculation up to $1,500 and that's
Okay.
the main thing. And I think I think that makes sense.
Then Elaine, I'll work with you on where to fit it. If it's done, if the low income is the last step,
Okay.
if it's after childcare,
Okay.
we'll figure out what schedule to put it in.
Okay.
And then we'll just have that looked at. You sound like who's on
Okay.
first, what's on second when you start talking about the schedules.
Sorry. It just, anyway.
It rolls off
Never
your
knows.
tongue, and I'm
Yeah, we've
sure
been
it does.
working. Deborah's one of those people out there who we've been working on this for like decades, it feels like. So, all right, so
All right. Yeah, let's,
okay with stopping and transitioning over on low income? Judge Palmer?
Yes,
Yep,
yes,
okay, good.
please.
So, Judge
I'm
Williford
good.
and
Well,
Katie.
Judge Palmer, we appreciate you because I recognize that last time you were supposed to get an hour, and we were supposed to get an hour, and instead we got 2 hours. You could have said, well, then I get all 2
No,
hours
look,
this time. But
if it was up to me, I'd just do it. And
I know, but we got to do it the right way.
minutes, but an hour's plenty.
Okay, so
Thank
what we'll do, I know there are several things on the agenda that don't have to do with Dr. Venor, and maybe what we can do is give Dr. Venor the next, 35 minutes or whatever she has left to talk about these case scenarios that were sent to her, and kind of walk us through those. And then Dr. Venor has to leave, and then we can continue to talk about those, or we can move on to some of the agenda items that Dr. Venor is not necessarily involved in. Is that okay with you, Katie? All right, Dr. Venor, take it away.
Oh, thank you. So we're moving on to the memo on time sharing. And I want to thank Katie, and there was somebody else that with the case examples. I apologize, I couldn't remember the name, but thank you for submitting them. And
We
what
got a
it
couple
really,
actually, Dr. Venor. We had both Miss Scott, Christina Scott, and Johanna contributed examples. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Johanna and Christina too, because they really, what they underscored for me is just how difficult it is to calculate days in Georgia, particularly since you have that parenting plan template that has that option of first, third, fifth weekend. Who calculates fifth weekend? I mean, do that on your fingers. You just can't. And so I can understand why you're wrestling with that definition of days, overnights. And the other
to
thing that
complicate matters, if I may, because I've seen that first, third, and fifth weekend a lot, and at least 2 of those fifth weekends usually fall either in a Christmas week or a summer vacation. And so then you're trying to figure out, well, does the fifth weekend take priority over the Christmas, or, so it really does get complex.
And the other issue is the split custody. I mean, you guys came up with some really good examples on the split custody. And I just want to, while we're talking about those times, I do want to say that if you look at the memo, the statute directs the courts, and please correct me because I don't, I'm not a lawyer, to develop a parenting plan. And it looks like if you look at, there's a footnote in here that a lot of local courts have adopted it. And if you look at the footnote on page 3, and it carries over to page 4, you can look at examples of that parenting plan that's got that every other weekend that Judge Williford was talking about that falls on. And I'm wondering if, I'm just going to put this out there because this is a policy decision that doesn't involve me. Can you change it at the court level? The second thing is, can you automate it? Oregon, what they do is they have a parenting plan template, and it calculates the number of overnights for you. So, because most of those parenting plans, there's a checkbox for every other weekend or every third weekend or whatever, but it doesn't do a sum. And so that's a really important thing. And those are things you can discuss without me, because that's really important for your definition. And I see Carol's got her hand up, and
Yeah,
I'll
she
let
does.
Heather.
I was gonna say, Carol, did you have a comment on that before we go any further?
Yeah, and I think we can come back and talk about this perhaps with Dr. Bonor is not present, but I just want us to be mindful that the recommendations on page 5, item 14 of the review committee's report specifically states the statutory modification needs to avoid the concept of a standard parenting time. Okay, and so we really need to be mindful of that and not get hung on the 5th weekend issue when there is no standard parenting time in the state. And we specifically spent a lot of time talking about we wanted to avoid that. So
Yeah, I apologize because I must have misstated it. If you look at page 4, there's an excerpt of the parenting plan, and it's certainly not standardized. It's just there's all these options. It's just that the 5th Friday is one of the options, or if you look even that's, yeah, then you can look at the other ones. So it's not a standardized amount. There's standardized options with other options. So I apologize that I missaid that. I must have said something that made it sound like there was a standardized amount of time, but really there's a standardized parenting plan template, with this
Yeah,
has one.
There's templates that are used in the state and recommended. In reality, I agree with Carol that there's no law that says this is the standard, but you also have to look at, I think in order to make something work, you have to look at reality, what's really happening in the circuits in the state. And I can only speak for the circuits that I've practiced in Middle Georgia for 20-something years. And in Middle Georgia, there's very much a standard, okay? And it's called a standard. And so judges will say from the bench, Bibb County standard, Culpeper standard, Jones County standard. And everybody who practices in the circuit knows what that means exactly, and I don't know how prevalent that is across the state.
I do the same thing.
But I know that I practiced for 20-something years in probably 20 counties in Middle Georgia on a regular basis. And every single one of them had a standard, and you knew what that standard was. And you could actually tell your secretary, print me off Culpeper standard and attach it as Exhibit A, So there may not be legislatively a standard, but there is. And, I do think the judges should try to get away from that. But for ease of time and for ease of consistency, I do think that judges do use the standard. And I have seen that, for instance, the Bibb County standard, the Culpeper standard is first, third, and alternating 5th weekends. And we've tried to get away from that and just call it alternating weekends, because that 5th weekend does become so problematic. But I don't know if anybody else has that experience, but I do think that a lot of circuits do have their idea of the standard.
Just to be clear, the point I'm making is that if there's a standard or not a standard, you in Georgia need to feel comfortable with how to add those number of days, because the problem is that all these time sharing adjustments that we're talking about, they're based on the number of days per year. And so in practice, when, we say a threshold of 100 days, people have to, in their head, if they have that standard of every 3rd weekend, they're probably thinking, well, how does that fit into 100 days per year? So my issue is just the calculation, that there has to be a way, either examples or automation. Does that make sense, Carol?
yes, and for example, I can certainly post to the webinar or to the Zoom chat the link to the Minnesota calculator, for example, I did a schedule yesterday in less than 4 minutes for both parents, okay, to populate the number of days based upon a more standard parenting time that we used in the Northeastern Judicial Circuit, which is different, you know, and I just want everybody to be mindful that the committee that researched and reported was extremely concerned that we should avoid the concept of a standard parenting plan. So I think if you're going to use an automated calculator that easily tells you what your numbers are, and, you know, I sort of laughed about it yesterday because I thought the younger generation that is so savvy with their phones could probably figure out their own number of days in 4 or 5 minutes. It makes it very easy, but I just wanted to not go down the slippery slope of standard parenting plan.
I want to echo what Carol said. I'm very concerned about the notion of standard parenting time. I think it opens a can of worms with the idea that maybe we're flouting the statutory requirement of focusing on the best interests of the children, even if there are circuits that have habits and have norms. You know, I don't think we need to do anything that implies anything other than the statutory requirement that parenting time be based on the best interests of the children.
I do feel like I need to clarify that, like if you look at that excerpt on page 4, that isn't a standard parenting plan. There's options there. The parents are supposed to decide which box to check.
Right. I agree with you, Dr. Bernard. I read you loud and clear.
Yeah, in Oregon, they have a similar thing. Theirs is, it's not a standard parenting plan. It's parents, let's talk, let's check what box, let's figure out what's a holiday in my world. And
Right.
then it sums it up. So.
Right. And so you don't really have to discuss the concept of standard parenting plan to address the issue of the parenting time adjustment. And I really caution people to not go down that slippery slope in the terms of the statutory language that might be used by this subcommittee going forward.
The only thing I have a problem with is that 5th Friday is going to be hard to program, you know,
Johanna, I think, has a comment on that. So.
Yes, so Oregon, I saw that calculator. I mean, if Georgia wanted to put the money towards having a calculator like Oregon's or Minnesota's, it populates the entire calendar from what I understand. And then you can back out, like you could unclick certain dates if you really wanted to get into that first, third, and fifth. And honestly, what I imagine is going to happen, at least with pro se litigants, which is my background. I mean, I'm dealing with pro se litigants every day in our family law center. Some of them may use such a calculator. Others are probably going to want to know just how many days is it if I use what we call the old standard sometimes versus some of the newer standards. And I would imagine that counties would develop, or courts would develop, you know, behind the scenes, their own little cheat sheets where, okay, if it's this standard in Culpeper or whatever, we're going to go with that's 101 days. And, you know, you don't have to really second guess the calculation because we'll just know what those numbers of days are. So I agree, you know, and to answer your question, Dr. Bernard, the 24.10, that's just, you know, it has to be substantially in compliance with that form, but Hall County's packets that we use, it doesn't even have the first, third, and fifth. So as an option. So I would guess that every county will come up with a quick cheat sheet there. So
yeah, that's good because I do see that DeKalb doesn't have it. And, back to Judge Palmer's point on that low income, can you program it? I'm an amateur programmer. That's a no brainer to program. When I look at this parenting plan template, it's not a standard. And then I see that 5th Friday, that's a hard thing to program for exactly the reason that Katie mentioned, that sometimes that falls on a holiday. So you would have to look at the calendar year. It's not an easy program, but Elaine can check that with, her programmers to see if that's true,
Yeah.
but off the top of my head, but again, you know, I know you all understand it, and we could go back to, since my time's limited to the bulk of it, you know. But I just, since we're there, I think it's a good thing to discuss. Are we okay with going back to the exhibits? Because what I'd like to do is review the 3 different calculations.
Yes, please.
Yeah. And so exhibit 1 is the cross credit, and all these, we have the same scenario where we have parent A, which is the, or parent B, which is a non-custodial parent in these cases. And we have an income of 3,100 for parent A, the custodial, 43 for parent B. When we look at their combined income at 7,400, we look up at the table and we come up with a basic obligation of 1,100 on line 3. We multiply that by 50% to account for duplicated expenditures. Some states are going to 60%, and it could be 65% based on the data. And we calculate each parent's pro rata share in line 6. Line 7 has their number of overnights. So we calculate the percent of time. On line 9, we take that percent of time and we say that's the amount retained. So like for parent A, their basic obligation is a share of the shared basic obligation is 693 on line 6. On line 8, their percentage of time is 73%. So they get a credit for $506 on line 9. On line 10, the difference that they owe the other parent is 187. If you do the same work for parent B, that parent owes parent A 699. We look at the difference, and the adjusted order is now $512. And it would have been line 3, 638 for the sole custody. So now on the next page, we look at the Minnesota-Michigan formula. They use the same formula. I'm going to do the old Michigan was an exponent of 2. So if you look at that formula, it's got 2 in superscript all over the place. And Minnesota actually uses a superscript of 3. And Michigan now uses a superscript of 2.5. The higher the superscript, the higher the order and less of an adjustment. So if you want a bigger adjustment, you want to have a smaller superscript. Based on calculations, if you wanted this formula to mimic Oregon, you would use a superscript of about 1.75. And you'll see that in the case examples. And if you look at the top part of that equation, that's essentially the cross credit, except we take the time, which is that BS, and square it. So exhibit 2 goes through that calculation. Line 4 is up to line 4 is no different than what you've seen. Line 5 actually isn't any different. And then what we do is we take that percentage of time on line 6, and then we multiply it by, I'm looking where I squared it. Oh, okay. So we're doing a cross credit here, and then you do the squaring of it on line 10. And then when you go through it, and because you have to calculate that denominator, which is the, I think that's the line 9. I should have looked at this closely. I developed it a few days ago. But in the end, you get a line of 13. And I will say that Minnesota doesn't step this all out mathematically. It's a black box. So you just punch in Minnesota, you would just punch in the days by, and then it would come out with that 13. The same in Michigan, essentially, is what it does. It doesn't do all those steps. But if you mathematically want to walk through all those steps, you would go through line 7 to 12 to see how that calculation is done manually. So it's a little bit more confusing to do manually, but that's not an issue in Georgia. Exhibit 3 is Oregon's, and here it's a simple lookout table. It's the same example, except when we get to line 5, what you do is you see that little red with that 0.1537. That's from the next page, and you can see that the parent B has 100 overnights, and we look at the exhibit on page 3 for at 100 overnights, you get 15.37. So you just punch that in, and then you multiply that 1.37 times the combined basic obligations, so the amount on line 3, and you get $169. So the non-custodial parent gets accredited $169 and the order is $470. So the cross credit would give you an order of 512 for this case. The old Michigan, which is a 2 exponent, would give you 502, and the Oregon would give you 470. Now, if we used Minnesota, which has an exponent of 3, it's going to be higher than 502. If we use Michigan, that has an exponent of 2.5, it's going to be higher. So the higher the exponent, the higher the order amount is. So I'm going to pause there to see if there's questions. That's the math behind it. And there's a bunch of case examples on page 7. And I'll jump to that actually, because you can see the case examples that Miss Scott and Johanna and Katie put together. And what we have is I reordered them because I put the split custody last, because split custody gets a little bit more messy. So I did the ones that were simple, where there was a primary custodial parent and there's different overnights. And if you look up the mid column, there's the Georgia Soul. So this is before any adjustment. There's the cross credit next to it using the 150 multiplier. And then you can see Old Michigan, where that exponent was 2, and that gives you 192, and Michigan uses 2.5. So that's 260. So it's higher. Minnesota uses 3, so that's 315. And then that second to the last column is just to illustrate if you went to a exponent of 1.75, it's pretty darn close to Oregon, which is 160, and then that's 1.75. So at this point, we can either talk about the formulas and go through the case examples, or we can talk about the split custody, or we can talk more about the definition of days. It's really your choice.
Well, I don't know that we should jump ahead until we kind of flesh this out a little bit more. I know that you said in the cross credit formula, you used 150% multiplier or 1.5. Didn't you tell us that was very outdated? The 1.5. So if we were going to, I'm a fan of the cross credit formula. I know some others are too, but if we were going to go with a cross credit formula, didn't we talk about maybe looking at 1.6, maybe even 1.7 or somewhere in between?
Yes.
Okay. Johanna,
And that would raise it.
right.
Right.
Johanna, you had your hand up.
Yes, Judge, I was curious, and I don't know if this is a typo or if I just misunderstood something, but on that page 7 with the case scenarios, I was trying to understand on the very first line item 5, why the cross credit, is that saying that the adjustment would be $22, or that's the final order would be $22?
That's the final order. And by no threshold, I mean that there isn't a threshold of like 140 overnights. So it applies to this case where there's 125 overnights.
So that seemed dramatically different than the other formulas that you have here. And I was confused by that, because when the exhibits that you gave us, you know, on the first page, you know, where for exhibit 1, that cross credit, if that's the same cross credit we're talking about, that reduced that by 20%. It reduced the child support amount in Georgia to 512, would be a 20% reduction. And then exhibit 2, which is the exponent of 2, it reduced it by 21.5%. And then the last example, Oregon, reduced by 26.4%. So it seems like they would be like close together, and that 22 just seems, it really jumped out at me, like, why would it be so little?
The cross credit is more sensitive to her income being higher.
Okay. So that's a notable difference to me for people who are looking at the cross credit. I don't know if, I've tried to look back through some of your other material, for like charts like this. Oh, that's not gonna work. Okay, where you have the graph showing, the changes. I don't know, that might be visually something for, I mean, that's up to your committee, of course, but to visually see what the differences are between 2 or 3 formulas, in terms of how the adjustments work at different levels. Am I making sense? Because that's a pretty dramatic, maybe I'm the only one who thinks that seems very dramatic to me. The transport amount would be $22. But the other
Then the
model.
other case examples, those ones that Johanna was talking about, where we graph it out, we usually use the non-custodial parents' income is more than the custodial parents'
Okay.
income. That's statistically what we see.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we started with a case example that's probably, it happens, but it's not the majority of the cases.
Out of the norm.
Okay, well, I mean, even if you compare number 6, well, that's also, okay. I'll think on that. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Carol, did you have your hand up? No.
So I have a question for Dr. Bernard. I wanted to make sure I'm understanding with the Oregon, the table that is part of your exhibit 4. So in their, I guess in their calculator or their worksheet, does the table actually show up like this and they have to kind of go and pick based on, are those numbers of days or nights?
Yeah, sorry, there isn't a heading. So the numbers without a decimal point are the overnights is what Oregon uses.
Okay.
And then so this allows, they actually have a black box too, so they don't, it doesn't show up in their calculator. They just plug in the number of overnights and then it shoots out. But it's nice because it's transparent. So if you have a pro se litigant, they can look up exactly what adjustment they're going to get.
Okay.
Based on
So
the number.
so it's just a box they put in and then it does the calculation, but you can actually look at the table, kind of like how we have ours. Okay. Got it.
And is Oregon one of the states that has the automated calculator or the parenting time calculator, right? Where you actually go in and put in, and then it figures it out for you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I tried to send the link to the Minnesota calculator to everybody. I don't know if they got it or not, but just go and look at it. Oregon's is pretty much the same. I mean, they're very similar.
Yeah, I played with it. It's really not complicated. It's just trying to get people used to using it.
Yeah. It's just kind of click, 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 and you get in,
Yeah.
So, and again, I remind everybody that by consensus, in our page 4 of our final report, item 5, we reached a conclusion that a parenting time calculator should be created. So that was in our recommendations. So again, I just, for what it's worth.
Dr. Bernard, can I ask a question about the exponents and which number different states are using? If there is a trend towards 1.75 versus 3, I mean, how you decided to use 2 for our sample?
There are only 2 states that use this formula, Michigan and Minnesota. Minnesota just started using this formula maybe 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And they debated whether to use 2 or 3 based on, actually they based also considered Oregon's formula. And Michigan has been using this formula for maybe 10, 15 years. And they started with 2, decided that gave too much of adjustment, then went to 2.5, and then they got wait a minute, I'm sorry, they started at 2, then they went to 3 because they thought it was too big of adjustment with 2, so they went to 3. And then they got some feedback from an advocacy group that it wasn't even covering food costs, so they went to 2.5. So Michigan has changed it 3 times. In Minnesota, you know, I've heard some circles say that they probably should have gone with 2. And at the time, Minnesota didn't have a very generous adjustment, so they went more conservative, which is the 3.
Thank you.
And I will say that there's, I mean, I'm glad that Carol brings up with the group of the committee, the time sharing group, there's a couple of summaries of what that study committee, page 3, recommended a 2-year time frame for averaging days, overnights, did not reach a consensus on definition, recognize that some sister states had no definition, and there's some more comments in there that's worth reading that paragraph or summary, you know, because they did do a lot of hard work, and I do want to recognize their work and not have you guys reinvent the wheel. And I'm glad that Carol's sharing that knowledge. So
We have 7 more minutes of Jane's time. So what other discussions do y'all want to have in that brief time?
This is a question that I have. I understand, I guess, Dr. Todoro's committee, that the actual BCSO tables, there has been no final recommendation as to whether those should be changed or not. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're
Correct.
still working on that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But the Child Support Commission will hear information on that on August 11 at that meeting.
And Dr. Bernor, can you just, my understanding from some of our prior meetings is that 1.7 is probably the most current accurate number. Not to say that other states are using it, but that was sort of where we are. And the 1.5 goes back to 1989, because I mentioned that I was in 2nd grade in 1989. Is that right? Did I hear that correctly?
you know, I need to go back to my notes to see whether it was 1.65 or 1.7. I'm sorry, I don't have that off the top of
No,
my
it's okay.
tongue. West Virginia just went to 1.6. Most states use 1.5. Virginia uses 1.4. And Oklahoma uses a sliding scale multiplier, which doesn't make sense with the economic data, but I think it starts at 1.75 and then goes down to 1.5. It's in one of our briefing things. But yeah, I think you're right. I would be comfortable with 1.6, probably 1.65. I have to look at 1.7. I have to relook at my notes.
Okay. I will say I'm pretty confident that at 1.7 was thrown out there. Not to say that I didn't latch onto the wrong number, but that's what has stood out in my mind's eye.
I remember that as well.
And
So
I will say that we ran it for West Virginia, the difference between 1.5 and 1.6. It's not a dramatic difference. It's usually just a few dollars. You know, it might be $10 a month. You know, since I only have just a few minutes, I do feel like we've touched on everything on the memo except for the issue of the custody.
mhm.
And that's
Jane, you
on
broke
page
up
6.
just a
Broke
little
out,
bit
but
there.
you broke up that we've touched on everything, but what?
The split custody
Okay.
and
What do you
children
mean
with
by,
different.
what do you mean exactly by split custody? Are you talking about joint custody or shared custody? What do you define what you mean by that for me?
If you look at page 6, and I excerpted the definition from the guidelines.
Okay.
So it occurs when there's at least 2 or more children of the same parents, and one parent is the custodial parent of at least one child, and the other parent is the custodial parent of at least one other child.
Okay, I was just
And-
making sure that we were using the same terminology. One child lives with one parent, one child lives with the other parent. Okay.
Exactly. And what, as you know, Georgia directs you to do 2 calculations.
Right.
And states take it a step further. That's unusual. Georgia stops and has 2 orders, and most states take it a step further and say use the difference. And Arizona has some language in the appendix that is really plain speak on that. And I encourage Georgia to look at it. I mean, it's a policy decision, but it's that's what most states do, is they do exactly the same thing, but they take it 1 step further and use the difference as the order amount. And that way it's just a little cleaner. It was a little bit cumbersome when we analyze the data, but you know, researchers come last. I mean, this is really about the children in Georgia. So, but it would be nice just to have 1 order. The other thing that this touches on, and I want to make a distinction, is that that's split custody, that there's each parent is a primary custodial to 1 child. It is possible for 1 parent, there's still 2 children or more, to be the primary custodial of both of those children, but have a different time sharing. Like 1 kid comes over 0 amount, you know, they might be a teenager. There are some case examples on that. And then the other one comes over 100 overnights. And the best practice on that is to average it. Average the time. And so Arizona has some very clean language about if it's each parent is the primary custodial of at least 1, use those 2 worksheets. And then if it's just an issue of different time sharing, but 1 parent is the custodial, the primary custodial of all of them, just average the time.
That's helppful to know, Dr. Venor, because I will say, I feel like in my practice these days, I'm seeing more and more situations where I think the proper terminology these days is resist refuse, but we're having, you know, resist refuse situations with usually teenagers. I will note for Dr. Venor and for the committee that Georgia does have some case law. It is not quite as clear as the example as the description of the Arizona language, but we do have some case law in Georgia that says that where you have split parenting and you are just having a pay the difference situation as opposed to checks crossing in the mail, which of course these days is a figurative thing anyway, because who writes checks and puts them in US mail? But that talks about that, you know, that you can net out the difference. And when the oldest child ages out, then, you know, even if the check was going from mom to dad, while there were 2, if the oldest child ages out and the situation and the child support needs to reverse and just be for the 1 remaining child, that is what is to be done. So we don't have, it's not in our statute, but we do have some direction about netting differences and how you deal with it when 1 child ages out in a split parenting time situation in our case law. And if anybody wants that case site, ping me afterwards and I'll look it up for you. But it's but I do know we do have that guidance in Georgia. It's just not in our statute.
You might be codifying it then if you were to do it.
And it is 11:40.
It
Jane,
is
do you-
11:40. Yeah, if you
Yeah.
need to go, we appreciate your time. And it looks like we will have you again on August the 11th at 10 a.m. Is that accurate, Elaine?
Well, we have a July meeting of the of this subcommittee.
Okay,
And, oh, here we go. Here's my little program. July 21 statute review at 2 p.m. on that Friday.
okay.
And then we'll also have the commission meeting on August 11. And Jane, you're welcome to join us at that commission meeting if you want to. If I have not
we'll
sent
see.
you the date, I will.
We'll see Jane then on July 21st at 2 p.m. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, thank you all. Sorry I had to go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Does anybody want to continue on any discussions on the parenting time deviation outside of Dr. Venor, or should we move on to some of the other business on the agenda?
I have a question for the committee, and maybe for the chairs, for both Judge Wilford and for Katie. So is it the intent of this committee to first kind of come to consensus about the parenting time, if we're going to adopt Minnesota or the cross, multiplier versus Oregon? I guess my concern would be, at what point then are we going to discuss the terminology as it relates to nights or days? Is it the intent first to kind of come up with that formula, and then we can talk about what a day is or what a night is?
Well, I am a strong believer in you can talk things to death. There's a quote that says that perfect is the enemy of good. And with the committee that worked on this for years, and now we're continuing to work on it, at some point, I think we have to make some decisions, which is what I sort of appreciated Judge Palmer this morning going, all right, let's do that. I think we need to get to the point where we figure out which one are we going to do? Are we going to do the cross credit? Are we going to do, what are we going to do? And then, okay, now that we've decided that, how do we accomplish it? We know that one of the big things is, how are we going to define a day? And that is one of the things that consensus couldn't be really, or how are we going to calculate the time, I guess is a better way to say it. And that's something that no one could reach consensus on. But at some point, we just have to make a decision and say, what do y'all think? Is it more than 12 hours? Do we put the whole schedule in this calculator? It's automated calculator, and let it decide, what do we do? And then I guess we put it to a vote and we just decide and we go, okay, this is what we're going to do. But I guess the purpose of having Dr. Venor was for the subcommittee members to actually have her experience, her knowledge, her information about what she has seen work and not work and what other states have done. And we would have her here to ask any questions that we wanted to ask and glean any information we wanted to glean before we kind of made that decision or put that to a vote. So I guess with that said, Katie, you may want to add to that, but I guess with that said, does anybody feel like we're at a point where we can say, all right, what are y'all thinking? Or do we need, Elaine, how much more time do we have with Dr. Venor? I know we only have so much time and so much budget with her. And at some point you make the decision and then you get Dr. Venor to help you kind of figure out the semantics of, and technically how all that's going to happen. You're on mute, Elaine. Elaine, you're on mute.
Sorry. I muted myself for just a minute because my phone rang. So, okay. So July 21st, we have that meeting, the next statute review. Then we have August 18 at 1:30 in the afternoon, and that is statute review. And then September 21. So we have 3 more meetings. And that Thursday, September 21 is 10 a.m. Our fiscal year for our budget and contract ends on the September 30. So that's why we could go through September. So our goal is to finish this work with Dr. Venor by September, the end of September. And then, work with Holly Carter, who, Holly's still on with us. Work with her on what the language would look like for a bill and low income parenting time, the table itself, which could include the low income table. So to be ready for a bill for January, and everything that we have to pull together to also be able to explain this to legislators so that they can understand it. Now, we also have Senator Strickland's idea, Judge Williford, about him chairing a committee within the legislature for us where he could pull together a meeting. And you talked about that. I think it was at the commission meeting on May 2nd. You covered that very well. So we also have that.
Would really like for us, and I think Katie and I intended to meet with him and figure out how that would happen. But I really wanted to have a better understanding of what it is that we're recommending before I go to the legislator on any level
Right.
and say, you know, here's what we're thinking. So I have not yet set that up with him, but I think that is even more reason for us to go ahead and start making some of these decisions.
Right.
And instead of continuing to talk it to death, so that I can say, here's what we're thinking, you know, but
Yeah,
Can we make a
perhaps the
point to
meeting,
try to do that for the next meeting then, to basically say, okay, let's take the vote and decide which recommendation we're gonna go with? Because I agree, I think we've talked about it quite a bit. I think, and again, with her recommendations, Dr. Nor's recommendations, you know, we have a lot of information. I think we have enough to hopefully move forward now.
as
Okay.
long as we finish by September, we're good. So we have 3 more meetings to pull all this together and to make decisions.
well, we do, but we have decisions. I'll call them layered decisions. You got to make like decision
Exactly.
number 1 before you can make decision number 2, and you know, that sort of thing. So why don't we just plan on then have whatever questions that are burning questions you have left to ask Dr. Venor in our next meeting, and then as many of you who can attend, please try to attend, because then we will say, all right, guys, which one of these do you think we should, you know, go with, you know? And so, you know, you may already have in mind kind of which one you like or you're leaning towards, but, you know, maybe any questions that you have, let's be ready to ask them, get them answered, talk about them, and then make a decision, and just continue to move on with these, you know, the definitions of the, you know, the time and, or the overnights or whatever it's going to be. Have some idea in your mind about what you think is the best. Nothing's perfect, but the best way to go. Any questions that you have for Dr. Venor on that, and let's try to get moving on something in July so that we'll have the August and September to sort of flesh that out and figure out what we need to do to get it done. All right, any other discussions or questions about the parenting time deviation?
Elaine, how hard would it be to ask Dr. Venor to update the case scenario exhibit 8 with the cross credit column being updated for 1.7 instead of 1.5?
In
Is that
fact,
all-
if she could do 1.6, 1.65, and 1.7. I don't know how hard that would be, but just to give us an idea of how much it changes per increment, that would be nice.
All right, so I'm on page 7.
Yeah,
of the
exhibit
case
8.
Scenarios.
Mhm,
All right, and that's exhibit 8.
mhm.
Okay, so which one do you want updated, or which ones?
So the cross credit column,
Okay,
she told us she used the 1.5, but we know that to be a outdated number. And then she told us about, you know, some states using 1.6, some using 1.65. And then I recall her telling us that, you know, today's most accurate number is 1.7. And I
Mhm.
remember us having the discussion. Like I said, I referenced the fact that I was in 2nd grade in 1989.
Right.
That, you know, it would be my preference if we go that route, that we use the most current numbers. They're gonna become outdated anyway. Let's don't start outdated.
Yeah, truly.
So I think she was, you know, just now she indicated she'd go back and look at her notes. But
Okay, so update the cross credit for each one of those scenarios,
right,
The
that
multiplier,
column,
she
using
was using
1.7.
1.5, yeah.
but
Right.
use 1.7. All
Or-
cross credit.
Or if it's not hard to do, I'd like to see a 1.6, 1.65, and 1.7, so we could see per increment, how much does it change? I mean, she said there really wasn't much of a difference between 1.5 and 1.6, but I'd like to really see what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Okay, so for all of the cross credits because there are what, 4 pages, approximately 4 pages of the cross credits. You want to see her provide an update on those using the 1.6, 1.65, and 1.7,
Please.
right? Okay,
Yes.
okay. Yeah.
So it's almost like there'd be 3 sub-columns under the heading cross credit.
Or maybe a suggestion is she could just do a separate schedule with those 3 calculations in it, so it doesn't get all jumbled up into the other numbers.
Okay. Okay. I'll ask her, have that as an action item for Jane.
Anything else on what we would like Jane to do, or any thoughts that anybody has about what we need to discuss with Jane at the next meeting? All right, Latanya, why don't you update us on the status of the public survey, since we only have 8 minutes left? I don't know if we can get into any major discussions about anything else, but tell us about what's going on with the public survey, if you will, please.
Yes, I can do that. Let's see if I can share my screen.
We did tell everybody, if they, at the Family Law Institute, that if they had not taken the survey, to take it. So I hope that we got some results from that.
Yes, yes. And can everyone see the?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you. So yes, I'm just going to give an update on the, again, the changing the term survey from custodial parent and non-custodial parent to the different terms that we have listed below. These results are just from May the 16th through May the 31st. So the next time that I report on this, it'll just be we're just going to do it monthly. So the next time in July, we'll just have the results from the whole month of June.
Okay.
But from May 16th to May 31st, we still have the highest count of the custodial, just keeping it the same, the custodial and non-custodial parent, that is 584 that have voted. Next one, the orange little triangle, is the greater time parent, lesser time parent. We have 62 votes for that. We need that. The gray pyramid, I can't think of the name of it. Gray pyramid is the obligee, obligor, and that's voted 33. Next we have payee, payor, at 11. I mean at the yellow pyramid, which is at 85. We have the primary parent, secondary parent, 179 have voted for that. The receiver or payor, we have 81 who has voted for that. And at the end, of course, we have the enter your own suggestions, and we have that at 190. But again, the majority, which has been since we've started the surveys, has just keeping the terms the same from custodial and non-custodial parent. It's just.
Well, and unfortunately, and Latanya knows this to be true, when you're looking at other suggestions that people are making, they're not really making suggestions. Probably 90% of that 190 people are complaining about their child support case, which has nothing to do with the survey. So we're seeing very little useful information come in on that within that 190. And Latanya, I think what we need to do the next time when we show them through June, let's grab everything from the very beginning of the survey through June and see what we're looking at for the entire process.
The whole, I agree.
Yeah. Agreed.
So I noticed in the agenda, there was a note, Elaine, that the staff had looked at 11 occurrences where the term obligor is used in the statute with no definition, and a recommendation that future legislation include updating this term to non-custodial parent, or to whichever term is chosen to replace non-custodial parent.
Yes.
And I don't know how y'all found that, but I'm glad you did. Sometimes we just come across problems that we didn't know existed. So I think that's an excellent idea. I don't know of any reason why we would not do that. Does anybody have any discussion on that?
Well, I had a question about it when I saw that come through, and maybe I'm just not thinking about this correctly, or maybe the statutory drafting class I was required to take in law school. I think Mercer was the only school that had that mandatory class. Holly can speak to that. I'm sure it's served her well. I'm not sure it served me as well. But our statutory construction, yeah, that's what it was called. Anyway,
Statutes, yes.
at some point, aren't you allowed to use words with their ordinary meaning in a statute without having everything be a defined term?
Well,
So at some point, like, isn't obligor, I don't know, maybe that was my initial knee-jerk reaction to it, is, do we have to define every term if we're using it in the ordinary course? I mean, in this instance, and I could be totally thinking of this incorrectly, so y'all aren't gonna hurt my feelings, but when we use non-custodial parent in 19615, we say we are not referring to the parenting plan, we are only referring to child support obligation or not. And so we do define it because we are not using it in the ordinary course. I mean, calling someone a non-custodial parent when you're not referring to their parenting time in any way, I think warrants an explanation, but I'm not sure that obligor warrants an explanation in a child support statute. I don't know. I just wondered if at some point, are we going to define things to death when sometimes you just use words and expect people to know what they mean? But again, maybe I'm not thinking of my statutory construction class the right way, or even just statutory construction in general. Forget the class.
well, I don't think the recommendation was that it needed a definition.
Oh,
I think
okay.
the
Well, then maybe I misunderstood.
recommendation was that it needed to be replaced, so we're not using multiple different terms to mean the same thing. So if we're gonna stick with non-custodial, use non-custodial. If we're gonna use some other word, replace it with that. The recommendation was not, we need to define obligor, which is
Okay.
really
All right,
what
then I
you're
just-
arguing.
Okay. All right. I
At
follow
least
you.
that's the way I read it. It
Well, it
says
did,
11 occurrences where the
Yeah.
term obligor is used with no definition. Recommend future legislation include updating this term to non-custodial parent or any term that may replace non-custodial parent.
Okay.
Elaine?
yeah, that's what I was thinking, because it was just ironic that I found it. The reason I found it was because I was looking at Social Security, which, Katie, I'm going to get back with the person you wanted me to talk to. I was looking at something in Social Security in the statute, and I went, wow, obligor and obligor is used all the way through. And I was like, we must have gotten that from Tennessee all those, years ago. I'm just not really sure. But I actually found it then when I searched the statute. It's in subsection D, the nature of the guidelines and court's discretion. It's in the Social Security section. It's in subsection F, which deals with income at its own rehearing. And then it's also in subsection I for split parenting. So I was like, it was just weird to me that it
So
was
our
in
survey-
several different places.
Yeah, our survey is, are we going to use obligee and obligor, payor, payee? We're going to stick with non-custodial, custodial. And so I guess what you found out is there are places where
We're
we're
using
already
obligor.
using obligor.
Right,
Right,
obligor is in there, but not obligee. I was just looking and finding obligor, but that's why I thought, since we're dealing with perhaps changing the terminology, that those would be some of the areas we might want to take a peek and see, do we also need to change those terms as well?
For consistency.
For consistency's sake. I just thought it was just interesting. I was like, all these years I've been working with this statute and I had not noticed that.
Right.
So,
Probably
let's
because you read it just as the ordinary definition of the word and moved right on.
Yeah.
right.
Well, let's keep that for something to think about. I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
We only have a couple minutes left, so well, maybe we don't have any minutes left. The next meeting is 7/21 at 2 p.m. There's one scheduled for 8/18 at 1:30 and September 21st at 10 a.m. All meetings will be conducted in Zoom seminar, and everything that we did not get to today can just be moved. We'll continue to move it to the next agenda so we don't lose track of anything. So
Right.
the time now is 12:01. And unless anyone has anyone else to add, then I will wish you all a happy 4th of July. If I don't see any of y'all before then.
Oh, that's true. We do
I
have a
just-
major holiday.
I just
Mara?
wanted to say, I'm sorry. This is going to be my last meeting in this group. I am leaving Atlanta Legal Aid and going into private practice in a different area of law. So we already have someone teed up to fill in my space. So I know Elaine is going to be working on that, but I just wanted to thank all of you for these engaging and thoughtful discussions. And I've really learned a lot through this process. Thank you for letting me be part of it.
Oh, good luck to you, Mara. Congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
And thank you for everything you've contributed. I know it's been a lot.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you,
well,
Mara.
we are adjourned 12:02.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
weekend.
Have a good weekend.